All right, guys, we're going to start this unit screencast. The unit is Establishing a New Nation, and we're going to start looking at the first 5 presidents of the United States. And we're going to start off with President Washington. Right? You have to understand that the first couple years, the early years of the United States, we are going through a massive amount of changes. International, political, domestic, military, economic, socio-cultural. Massive amounts of change, massive amounts of growth. George Washington is unanimously elected as president April 30th, 1789. And he takes his oath of office. He is inaugurated on the steps of Federal Hall in New York City, which was at that time the current capital of the United States. George Washington is the one and only president who did not serve in Washington, D.C. The capital started off in New York City. It then moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and eventually it'll move to Washington, D.C. John Adams, the second runner-up in the election, is voted in as vice president. Here you see an image depicting George Washington's presidency. You see George Washington right here in the middle. This is John Adams right behind him. All right. Washington said to Adams on Inauguration Day how scared, how terrified he was to be president. This was almost more than he could handle, even though he handled it quite well. One of the first things Washington did when he took office was he wrote something called the Federal Judiciary Act, which outlined the roles and responsibilities of the judiciary branch of government, specifically the Supreme Court and all inferior courts, all the smaller courts below the Supreme Court. And it established that the Supreme Court will be made up of 6 justices. All right, 5 associate justices, 1 chief justice. Problem with that is they would have ties, which is why today we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. John Jay was appointed as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by George Washington. This is our Supreme Court as it is today. Chief Justice John Roberts down in the middle. Going down the bottom row, left to right, we have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Anthony Kennedy, again Chief Justice Roberts in the middle, Clarence Thomas, Stephen Breyer. Moving up to on the left, top left, Elena Kagan, Samuel Alito, Sonia Sotomayor, and our newest Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch, who was just appointed this year by President Trump. One of the other things that George Washington established was the policy and the idea of a presidential cabinet. Now, I don't mean where he keeps his silverware and his plates. I mean his group of advisors. He chooses some of the most intelligent people that he can think of to serve as his personal advisors. He chooses General Henry Knox as his Secretary of War, Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, and Attorney General, he appoints Edmund Randolph. You might remember some of these names. Randolph was the creator of the Virginia Plan. Jefferson, I think we've all heard of him, Declaration of Independence. These men serve as Washington's first advisors, along with Vice President John Adams. These guys make up the first presidential cabinet. Now, we don't have a Secretary of War anymore. That was changed later on to Secretary of Defense. It just sounded less aggressive, less intimidating. But things weren't all great. We had a lot of financial problems. We owed over $52 million in the year 1789. $52 million. And that was those standards. Today, that would be billions and trillions of dollars, hundreds of billions. We owed money to France, to Netherlands, to Spain. We even owed money to England. With all the taxes that we refused, the tea that we destroyed, we owed a lot of money. Our new Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, comes up with an idea. And it would fully support and strengthen a central government. What he wanted to do is, one, he wanted the federal government to accrue all state taxes, all state funds. He wanted all debt that the states were in, he wanted the federal government to take on that debt. So instead of having all the states pay off this money, it all went to the federal government. And his idea was that if the federal government owed money to people, other countries would be more willing to lend it to us, which would give us credit, essentially. It's kind of how banking works. I know it sounds weird. But to do this, he also asked the southern states to pay a little extra in their taxes. And to get them to go along with this, he fluffed their ego a little bit by suggesting we move the government to the south, which is why it was moved from New York City to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as the new capital along the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia was being built, modern-day Washington, D.C. That's why the capital is between Virginia and Maryland. They each gave up a tract of land, but we moved the capital to the south to make the South feel better about paying a little extra in taxes to help the government pay off debt and to accrue more. He also wanted to establish a national bank. That caused a lot of tension between the cabinet members, especially Thomas Jefferson, who was very much an avid states' rights supporter, believed the states should have more power than the federal government. Hamilton, very much opposite end of the spectrum. After all, Jefferson was a Southern Virginian farmer. Hamilton was a New Yorker. Big city versus the farm. It also came down to their interpretation of the Constitution. A strict interpretation versus a loose interpretation. They both would go to argue and fight over this, but eventually the federal government does establish a national bank. Which brings us to Washington's first real challenge was the Whiskey Rebellion. In Pennsylvania, farmers started a violent protest against the newly imposed whiskey tax. Why did farmers fight against it? Because it raised the price of their wheat and rye, which are some of the key ingredients in whiskey. So whiskey distillers were buying less wheat and rye because they had to pay more taxes. Farmers had more leftover, more waste, and they were losing money. Washington sends in the army, followed by General Henry Lee and Alexander Hamilton, to suppress the rebellion. Therefore, he is able to flex the federal muscle, as you will, use the U.S. Army, the federal army, and suppress the rebellion. He succeeded where the Articles of Confederation failed in Shays' Rebellion. Washington's next challenge was the French Revolution. Now, the French, especially Marquis de Lafayette, were inspired by our own revolution. So in 1789, the French tried it themselves. They demanded equality and liberty. Their actual chant was égalité, liberté, and fraternité. Equality, liberty, and brotherhood. Thousands of Frenchmen were executed. Anyone who was thought to or believed to be allied with the king or sympathetic to having a monarchy, they were executed. And they weren't just hung or shot. They used a brand new invention that someone by the name of Professor Guillotine came up, was the guillotine, where you were laid face down on the board and a giant sharp axe was dropped on the back of your neck, severing your head immediately. King Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette were also executed after being held in the Bastille. And the French Revolution goes on for years. Eventually, a military general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte takes command of France, leads France into a series of what's called the Napoleonic Wars, trying to conquer Europe and the rest of the world, essentially. This would actually give us a benefit in negotiating rights, parts of America, because he wasn't worried about America just yet. He figured he'd deal with us later. Washington, though, wanted nothing to do with this French Revolution. Nothing to do with it. People were mad. France had come to our aid during the American Revolution. Washington turns around and says, no, we're not going to get involved. We're going to stay neutral. We're going to keep to ourselves. We have enough problems of our own. We're not going to get involved in the French Revolution. England we keep trading with France and with England, because during the French Revolution, England and Holland and Spain all started attacking France. The kings got nervous. They saw the French people were rebelling against their king. Their king lost their heads. Their king lost their head, and, well, they didn't want to lose theirs. So they started attacking France in an effort to restore the French monarchy. Well, somebody into the French monarchy position. But being that we keep trading with France, England starts attacking our ships. John Jay is able to go over and negotiate what's called Jay's Treaty. They agree to repay for seized and damaged cargo and leave the Ohio River Valley again, but they're not willing to trade the British West Indies with us, which is essentially what we wanted. People were very upset with John Jay. Charles Pinckney is sent over to renegotiate, which gave us free travel on the Mississippi River and allowed us to store things in the city of New Orleans duty-free with France. Now, after 8 long years, 2 terms, George Washington decides to retire. Man is tired. He fought for 8 years in the American Revolution, served as the president of the Constitutional Convention, now served 8 years as our first president. Man's earned a break. So after 8 years, 2 terms, George Washington sets the precedent, sets the example for all other presidents to follow, and leaves after 2 terms. On his way out, he was, one, attacked politically for not supporting France, but he also makes a couple of statements in his farewell address. Number 1, he did not believe in the political party system. He believed that that political party would destroy our government. It would rip us in half. He also warned us against He also warned us against permanent alliances with countries. He believed in permanent neutrality. Friends, but not allies. After his retirement, Washington goes here, home, Mount Vernon, Virginia, where he gets to be with the love of his life, Martha, and rest and just do what he has always wanted to do and just be a farmer. Unfortunately, it doesn't last very long. December 12th, George Washington starts to get very sick. He gets a sore throat. He had been out riding all day on his farm, got a little bit of snow down the back of his jacket, starts to get a sore throat, starts to have a little trouble breathing. On December 14th, 1799, George Washington takes his last breath. The death of the general, as it was said. People were beside themselves, including current President John Adams, was just in utter shock and disbelief that the general, our first president, George Washington, had passed away. He is placed here in the original tomb at Mount Vernon, but in his will, it is left that he wants a new tomb to be built on site. And so after 8 or so years, this tomb is finished. The only problem is they don't make the entrance into the tomb big enough for his new sarcophagus. So they build a vestibule, a outer room around George Washington's coffin, as you can see there in the door. As a gift to the dead president, a marble craftsman and marble artist creates this beautiful stone sarcophagus, which you see over here on the right, which is embossed with the presidential logo and his name. And so Washington is kept out here while the rest of his family that had been in the original tomb are placed in this back room back here behind that door. In his will also, he leaves that all slaves on his plantation are to be set free upon the death of his wife Martha. This way to make sure that she is taken care of in her older years. But he is one of the only people in history to release all of his slaves upon his and his wife's death. And that's it, guys. That's it for President Washington. Remember to take your notes. Whatever style you want, whether it be Cornell, outline, mind map, chart, or just straight up sentence, make sure to take your notes. You can use them on your weekly quiz.